IVM.
In the 1960s, more than half a century ago, NASA scientists investigated ways of feeding astronauts on long-haul missions to Mars and beyond. The idea was to find systems which didn't rely on scarce natural resources in the void of space or on desertified planets like Mars. It turned out that those systems had already existed on planet Earth for hundreds of thousands and millions of years. Our ancient planetary co-inhabitants, microbes. Bacteria, yeast, microalgae, and other microorganisms can harvest energy from little more than the constituents of air, waste gases like CO2, and water to make plentiful amounts of nutritious protein.
It was truly exciting technology exploration in closed-loop systems. That is, systems which do not have negative impacts on their environment because they do not need to extract from that environment and which do not even generate waste. And of course, as we all know, many technologies which were only conceived by agencies in defense and space exploration have found transformative everyday applications in our lives. After technologies like water filtration, firefighting equipment, and wireless headsets, these closed-loop microbial systems could be next. And as NASA continues to fund its own research in the area, it's possible that microbial fermentation-based technology is going to be one of our major solutions to feed 10 billion people on Earth by 2050. Companies all over the world, from US-based Air Protein to Finland's Solar Foods, are bringing protein made through microbial fermentation to market. Not least, our exciting guests today on Feeding 10 Billion, who are performing alchemy in Bangalore, India.
But how does science go from this kind of early, exciting, almost fiction-like exploration to market? How do we get from the doubtless very expensive space travel tech to feeding 10 billion people? The fact is, many technologies never make it that far. In between the lab and mass adoption, there are many potential traps or pitfalls which innovations never clear. These traps come in many forms: a lack of capital to take the next step from lab to pilot scale, the lack of a regulatory framework to evaluate and therefore support new technologies, or the lack of a talent pool to power the needs of such innovations as they scale to manufacturing size. The list goes on. These traps are often called valleys of death, and often they can only be traversed with patient, visionary support from investors, governments, and foundations. We've talked on Feeding 10 Billion about the need for an ecosystem encompassing all these forms of support, and nowhere is this more true than in emerging markets like India. We need focused intervention in the form of research grants, financial investment, and other incentives from the government to create those cradles of scientific enterprise within universities and other players in the system.
Earlier in July, we recorded a GF Ideas India webinar with two guests who are both accomplished PhDs who can speak cogently to all of these challenges. One is from the investment side of the equation, while the other is a biotech scientist who has turned entrepreneur. Ritu Verma is co-founder and managing partner at Ankur Capital, a firm that is funding the next billion ideas, while Ezhil Subbian is CEO and co-founder of String, a synthetic bio company which makes microbial protein from methane. Ritu has backed Ezhil's vision with the catalytic capital we keep talking about on this show. We thought this webinar was so insightful that we wanted our listeners of Feeding 10 Billion to also listen in. Find out what it really takes to scale innovation in biotech in India. I'm Ramya Ramurthy, the communication specialist at the Good Food Institute, India.
And I'm Varun Deshpande, managing director at the Good Food Institute, India, and you're listening to Feeding 10 Billion. Ritu and Ezhil, I am excited to be having this conversation with you. So Ritu, Ezhil, I'm going to keep the first question super simple, something that you probably talk about all the time. Especially as leaders in biotech and in science, you're probably asked this question all the time. I'll start with Ritu. Could you talk me through a little bit your personal story of how you got here and what your background is?
So I started life as a physicist. So, I am a scientist at somewhere still there. So that's why I'm super excited to be here. So thank you guys for having me. I worked through multiple different companies, but I've always been sort of from product to market was my interest of sort of moving things in the innovation space. I used to work for Unilever globally through their R&D initiatives with many different countries, R&D as well as commercialization of those products. did that across a couple of other companies, and then kind of wandered into what I should say is the venture capital space, realizing that large companies have a very low risk appetite for innovation typically, right? So it's businesses first, and then this comes along. So somewhere venture capital kind of married the interest of sort of the innovation as well as sort of the business piece of it to actually be growing enterprises that can actually dramatically change industries or markets here. I think along the way, I also sort of worked a bit with Hindustan Unilever, which works a lot in the mass markets, and just seeing sort of the vibrancy of that market, was something that was just actually eye-opening for me. We all know it, but we don't know it till you're in it. For me, the intersection of setting up Ankur was between the fact that there is technology and technology changes that can kind of happen, as well as the fact that there are these large markets and, you're not thinking about technology changes for these markets specifically. It's a trickle-down effect, but can you actually innovate out of that to be creating that? And I think it was the right time to sort of do that. And that's kind of how I landed up setting up Ankur Capital with my partner, Subramanian.
Got it. And Ezhil, same question. We'd love to hear about your story. You were named by Niti Aayog and the UN as one of the women transforming India. And we'd love to hear a little bit more about you as well.
Thanks, Varun. Excited to be here. So, journey, very naively, actually, as soon as I finished schooling, I had this thought that I want to work at the intersection of biology and engineering. And lo and behold, a very naive thought, I think I kind of clung on to that concept throughout. So did my undergrad in biotech in India. And at that time, you didn't have a lot of biotechnology companies in India, right? Hardly any work in that space. I finished it, and pretty much my obvious choice was to go to the US for a PhD. One thing I learned in my PhD was, really delving deep, but also wanted to really be more on the application side rather than on the fundamental research side. So happened to actually cross paths with Frances Arnold at Caltech. And she was at that time spinning off a company from her lab. And, later in the call, we need to talk about the ease with which US universities are able to spin off companies, right? Because at that time, Caltech, I would say that each lab in Caltech probably had a company being spun out of that lab. It just so happened Frances was spinning off this company called Gevo. For those of you who are familiar, right, in early 2000s, Vinod Khosla of Khosla Ventures placed a bet on about 10 different biofuel companies. And Gevo happened to be one of those companies that he placed a bet on. So we had a very strong team, right? We had Costa backing up, we had Francis, and then it was also backed by Richard Branson from Virgin Biofuels. And that was my very first entry into startup and technology development. And then I realized that I loved doing that kind of work, which is basically, innovating, building products that really kind of cater to solve fundamental gaps in terms of life in itself, right? At that time, it was biofuels. Post Gevo worked with another company called Codexis, and there we were developing again cellulosic ethanol, as part of a project with Shell. So more early stage technology development, building IP, kind of going through that product rev cycles and optimizing your product, optimizing your process, and getting more and more entrenched in the space of synthetic biology, right? And realizing that was kind of things that I was passionate about. Post that, worked with another synthetic biology company, very well known in the US called Intrexon, that is not purely in the industrial biotech space, but they span, pretty much pharma, healthcare, nutrition, various aspects. Worked with them, and all along had some ideas about how to better develop tools for biology or biological engineering, which got me to starting work on string. One of the challenges that I wanted to try and look at is innovating close to markets where the solution is needed, right? And that was the other aspect of getting the operations for string here in India, in Asia. Because I believe that, when resources are plenty, some of the solutions that we come up with may not be the optimal for the solutions to work globally. And when resources are constrained, and I say resources, it's mostly capital, but also sophistication of technology, right? When it's constrained, then you come up with really creative solutions that are still robust. So that's part of also the reason for us to move string to Bangalore. And moved here in late 2013, early 2014, and I've then been in Bangalore last few years building string and building the products at string.
I think that it would be worth stating a little bit about synth bio more broadly, Ezhil, and Ritu perhaps as well, and generally talking about what's happening in the explosion of synthetic biology and how it's affecting a number of different industries and how it's projected to affect a number of different industries. For example, I just pulled up a report by McKinsey that came out a couple of weeks ago or a month ago. It's called the Bio Revolution. They've identified across different industries, and they're talking in terms of the trillions of dollars where the world is going to be in 10 years from now, right? So there's this famous saying from Mark Andreessen, very celebrated venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, where he said, software is eating the world about 20 years ago. And that kind of happened, right, across many industries. And now I think the saying has shifted to biology is eating the world because we're finding ways to program biology in ways that have never been possible in history. So would you like to speak a little bit to the proliferation of synth bio across industries, Ezhil?
Absolutely. To be even within the industry, it's quite mind-boggling at how much the industry is expanded. Like you rightly said, just in the last 5 years, if you talked about synthetic biology, I think unfortunately it got a lot of flack for just being in the biofuel space. But now if you look at it, it's food, it's consumer goods, it's clothing, it's milk, it's meat, right? From milk and meat to like vaccines for the pandemic that we have today. I mean, the industry is just exploding. And I think while it's still largely based around the core technology, I think the other aspects of the ecosystem that need to fall in place, whether it's the capital, whether it's the infrastructure, whether it's the people, I think that is starting to fall in place. Obviously, some areas like, let's say, the Silicon Valley or Boston is a lot more advanced in terms of being able to build all the requirements around this industry. Some other ecosystems are still starting to put that together. But I think just in the last 5 to 10 years, huge change, right? And like you rightfully said, we went from the atom driving a lot of our work to the byte driving a lot of our work, and now going into the decade where the gene and all understanding around it is starting to drive a lot of the work. I mean, think about it, right? Silk protein and clothing from silk protein. It really changes your conversations around how to conserve nature around us, right? Because no longer are you just looking at just a single point for all these raw materials to come in. I mean, at string, we'll talk about more, converting methane to protein for going into food, feed, cosmetics, and it's vast. And one of the big advantages, Varun, there is when we look at chemical processes, which was driving our work, let's say 50, 60 years back, right? The chemistries that we were looking at was very limited, right? The big advantage of biology is you're capable of a lot more interesting chemistries, which means a lot more interesting molecules for us to build things from. And while the technology and the knowledge was there, now I think we're adding the other parts in terms of making that technology more efficient, scaling it up, the scale-up facilities and stuff. So I think it's mind-boggling, but very, very exciting as to how the industry is taking off.
I can add to what Ezhil said, right? So I worked in an industry that worked with chemicals, or an industry that was a chemical giant here, right? And if you mentioned bio, right, it was like, oh yeah, that's just not scalable. For the scale of the industry that we are, we can't put these kind of things into our product, right? So that leap from going about talking to saying that chemical-based industry moving and the proof points that have happened in the last 4 years is absolutely amazing, right? Because I can tell you when I looked at the stuff from BASF, it was very little, right? I mean, there's a such about cellulosic ethanol, right? There was some of that kind of stuff around, but super little stuff 10 years back on any of this stuff, right? And that explosion has happened, last 4 or 5 years. And it's glad to see the proof points make it to market, because you have a lot of skeptics who would say that this is not scalable for the mass production that is needed for these kind of industries here. But glad to see the proof points there.
So we can get more into the technology and to String Bio and other portfolio companies. Could you tell me a little bit, Ritu, about Ankur Capital, what the kind of investment thesis is?
So we're an early stage fund. Our focus here is to look at the next billion, right, in India and beyond India. And essentially, we're interested in technologies that can kind of disrupt these markets. And for us, that means two things, right? It does mean software technologies and computing, etc., that comes along with it. But it also means, R&D-led kind of stuff, which can be game changers of how things can happen in these markets. And I think that's the point. At some level, there is support to us. That I think there are innovations that when they happen in, resource-rich regions, obviously there's a lot more money, right? So you throw a lot more money at the problem, right? So it's part of product development. And if you develop stuff for the Japanese market, you didn't care what the hell you threw in there to develop it, right? But when you move to markets like India, which structurally are different, price points are kind of different, innovation for these markets, which we call the next billion markets, kind of need to take that into account. And they develop very differently. And there's very little of that has happened. But I think our focus here is to be investing in those kind of companies.
I think we're all itching to talk about ecosystems and bottlenecks in ecosystems, but I want to park that for a minute. I wanted to ask you, when you do invest in these deep technology companies, particularly in these kind of, I don't want to say resource starved, but certainly different markets like India, it's a different kind of resource mix, let's say. What are you looking for in founding teams, right? So for example, Ezhil and Vinod, fantastic founding team. What would drive you to invest in someone like them? What are the characteristics you're looking for as an investor?
So we are looking for the technology and the value of the technology, right? But I think the other critical piece for us is the team behind it. I can tell you over the last 5 years, I've seen a whole bunch of companies. I don't think we have a dearth of, people with good ideas and actually good work behind it, right? But a founding team also needs to have the techno-commercial skills here, right? Because we're investing, right? We're looking to build a company. We're looking to get returns out of this company. It's not an academic project. So I think the team needs to have a mix of the market sense of what is kind of needed, as well as the depth in the technology, right? Because not having that also doesn't help. If there is no deep IP, there is no deep knowledge behind this piece, then it's, the motorcycle that you would get into. So I think those are the characteristics that I think we look for in a team in this space. The techno-commercial talent in India is kind of missing. It's an ecosystem gap.
So let's talk to someone then who knows a little bit about that, right? Like Ezhil, could you speak a little bit to your own company, The String, and what you're producing, right? I think everyone is keen to hear more about the SIMP platform and a lot of different things related to how you're converting methane into food. I think we'd love to hear a lot more about it.
So the core work that we're doing, right, we want to enable what we call our next generation ingredients. So a big topic of what GFI is enabling is these ingredients for the food space. So String is in that sector enabling next generation ingredients so that there is inherent sustainability and safety in these ingredients. There are a whole range of ingredients that we're looking at because we built a platform that allows us to look at a few different kinds of ingredients. The big focus for us is, of course, products that go into the alternative protein space. There are a few other industries also of interest for us, including agriculture, personal care, right? That's kind of the power of the platform that we've developed, which is a core synthetic biology platform. What this enables us to do is, as we've been talking about, it kind of enables us to expand beyond our chemical ways of manufacturing into more biology ways of manufacturing, right? And go beyond, what Ritu was talking about in terms of the proof point and actually start to commercialize a lot of these products in market so that, it's not so much a surprise for you to use ingredients that are produced using biological platforms anymore. So how do we do that? Well, this has been a big portion of our work for the last few years. So we have developed very interesting advances that we've had in the area of biology, in the area of chemistry, in the area of engineering. We brought that together and built a platform. We call it the String Integrated Methane Platform, or SIM. And this allows us to use the energy that is there in methane gas and convert it into the products that I was talking about. So we are converting methane into protein that can go into the food and feed sectors. We're converting methane into other ingredients that can go into the related sectors. One of the big advantages of String's platform is that working with methane coming from different sources, we are working with methane coming from natural gas. We can also work with methane coming from biogas. And the interest there is, if you look at methane from natural gas, the composition around the gas is different. Versus methane coming from biogas, the composition is different. So part of the innovation that we had to do was also develop a technology that could work with that kind of raw material variability. Because if you look at the bio-based industry, one of the key questions is raw material availability in terms of scale. Like, for example, to match the scale of the chemical industries, you need that substrate and you need a robust process that can work at very large scale, right? If you look at protein, food is in itself a very big industry. If you talk about feed, huge commodity market. Just in India, you probably have single customers who can take in lakhs of protein per month. So you need a process that will be able to scale and work at that large volume. But you also need a process that will work at smaller scales if you want to generate high value compounds that don't have very large market. So part of the technology that we built is a process that allows us to work with both these scales.
Ezhil, this is all quite fascinating. So could you also share a little bit more about the alternative protein product that you are working on at String?
So our first product to market, we call it ProFit. As I mentioned, for us, the interest is to take the alternative protein into both feed as well as food market. ProFit is microbial protein ingredient that can go into the feed market. We take methane, we built a fermentation process that can now use methane as a substrate, and then we extract the microbial protein or single cell protein that comes from this process. We process it and we take it as a high quality source of protein into the feed market. A lot of people get used to the fact that you can convert a gas into a solid, right? But, that's what it looks like. It's a fine brown powder, and the big advantage for the feed market is that it matches kind of the amino acid requirements that is required for good growth for your feed. The interest for us is, to take this into feed as well as food markets. And to take a step back, if you look at the alternative protein industry, right, we kind of have three key buckets. We've got the fermented protein products, we've got the plant-based protein products, and then we've got the cellular agriculture, right? The big advantage of a microbial protein product is, in effect, it actually, somebody like us can work with folks in the other two buckets as well. So we can take a microbial protein product, and this can become the source of protein for your plant-based burger, because that in itself requires a source of protein. We can take this into the cellular agriculture product because they also require very rich protein sources to be able to grow those cells. So that's one of the advantages, and those are things that we're exploring in the alternative protein space. The big advantage, actually, Varun, is interestingly, we started this work almost 6 years back. We had to talk a lot about what we were doing. Fortunately for us, we had, folks like Ritu and Ankur come on board and understand the language that we were speaking. But today, when we go into market, the conversation is very different. But, for us, the big advantage is the market is ready for us. And at this point, we are also ready for the market because we've done that amount of technology development and product development where we can now, match the market requirements.
Fantastic. I should say also that for anyone that is looking to learn more about fermentation as the third kind of pillar of alternative proteins, we've talked a lot about plant-based foods. We've talked a lot about cultivated meat, cellular agriculture. I think if you've been following GFI's work, we've been talking about that for a long time. We've been doing a lot deeper work now on fermentation as well. I'd also like to remind everyone that GFI's State of the Industry report on fermentation, which encompasses all the categories that form part of this exciting new technology bucket, will be out soon. So stay tuned and, of course, read it and get in touch with us if you have any questions. But on that note, we're going to take a short break on Feeding 10 Billion, and we'll be right back with more from Ritu and Ezhil.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another amazing week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. So it's been a really, really fun week this week. We've had a great episode with Anand Nilakantha on Cyrus Says. Anand was one of the writers of Bahubali, and he's done some really, really fun stuff since that. Ashish Vidyarthi also had a really good episode on his show, Begin the Journey. Please do check that out. You do know Yuddha is back, right? Definitely check it out if you haven't. Yuddha is our show about Indian ancient warfare. It's hosted by Anirudh Kanisetti and Aditya Ramanathan. Really, really great show. You should check that out for sure. And I forgot, Rishikesh was on the network as well. He was on Absolutely Right with Aditi Sarana. Do definitely check that out. With that, let's get you back to this show.
Welcome back. You're listening to Feeding 10 Billion with Ritu Verma and Ezhil Subbian. So Ritu, coming to you now, I think we should talk about ecosystems because I think that's a huge piece of this. So we're laser focused on building the enabling ecosystem, right? When we say enabling ecosystems, that means things like ingredients providers. It means things like talent pools. It means things like government grants, universities, infrastructure at the lab scale, pilot scale, manufacturing scale, mission aligned patient capital. It means all of these things. So when we talk about building these ecosystems, how do you know where to start? What would you say are the key pivotal pieces? Do all of these things need to grow together?
They do need to grow together, right? I do think that one thing that has happened here, and I'm sure Ezhil will also speak to it, that I think the government has played a role in providing that critical capital in these initial days, right? I think we have talent, right? The talent just has never quite been exposed to this world. That's a different issue, but as more and more examples come out, I think that will kind of happen, right? So I think that there is obviously needs of incubators and capital at that level to encourage more of this thing to happen. Without that, the rest of it can't make it happen, because this is not like the software industry, right, where you don't need the capital, right? You need the infrastructure for you to try things out, to do things here, right? So I think that's fairly critical. You have to sort of start there. But I think you can't stop there, right? If you stop there, at the end of the day, you just have a research lab. The talent for people to develop this is one, but the talent for people to develop this for a market and build a company is also very critical. So I think the ecosystem building, we're doing all of these different things, and of course there's a lot more that needs to happen. But one part of the ecosystem I don't see happening is the human talent, as I spoke about earlier, on the techno-commercial side.
Let's focus in on that, right? So, you mentioned techno-commercial side of human talent. We're doing a lot of work with universities and trying to seed curriculum. That's a slow burn. It's going to take a long time, right? We're talking about seeding curriculum at the master's level, then having PhD degrees come out of that. And then, hopefully there'll be 5 people whom Ezhil can hire 6-7 years from now. That's crazy. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually seed that talent ecosystem. So what are some interesting models that you've seen that work in that respect?
Every US university, there was a tech transfer office, right? Wasn't that researchers kind of jumped out and said, hey, now tomorrow I'm going to become CEO? Some people do that for sure, right? But there were also people who were scouting around there and scouting for technologies to commercialize, right? I don't know if you guys have heard of a company called A123, came out of MIT. It was a battery technology company developed by a prof at MIT, but had a CEO that worked on the technical commercial pieces of taking technology to markets here, right? So I think, because there's a lot of stuff coming out, and one is how you structure the availability, and universities kind of encourage the technology transfer office to happen so that tech that was developed would make it to markets. And I think you need those incentives in place for that to happen. I think starting from scratch with talent is a long journey, as you said, right? But we've had a generics industry, for example, which has also gone through commercialization, right? So it also takes people jumping off who've gone through that training to join or start companies like this, or take technologies and do that piece here, right? So in India, we don't have enough of that. And I think it's a problem of a chicken and egg, because they haven't seen these kind of companies built out in India. It's pretty safe to have a job with a large company, so you don't jump off here, right? So I think how you create an ecosystem that encourages that to happen on a shorter scale than if we start with courses academically, right? And I think that to me is a critical question. How do people see this? Because today in the software world, it's so perfectly all right for people to jump off and start a company, a startup. If you're in the biotech world, is it perfectly okay to jump out and start a company? I think not. Right? Where you've seen this in a much larger environment or a different environment, you've seen what it takes to commercialize this.
Ezhil, thoughts on talent sourcing and what you've looked at? I know you have a bit of you've been working towards commercialization, so your talent requirements have not been in the hundreds, right? But let's say tomorrow you had to hire 100 people. How would you go about it, and where would the gaps be?
Couple of things, Varun. I think what I've seen in the ecosystem is one, even though there is human capital available, the quality of the capital is not there for the biotech space. What I mean by that is, if you look at an average undergrad in at least the Bay Area, right, where you have your Stanford, your UCSF, your Berkeley, it's very high quality ecosystem that I'm comparing it to. If you look at an undergrad there, by the time they come in and work as an intern, they're quite aware of what is going on around the world. Their quality of thought is at a much higher level. What I see here is there are very few pockets where you have that kind of quality of thought. So even though there is very large human capital, the capital that you can hire to do kind of cutting edge work, right, where they need to have the depth in terms of technical skills, but also the awareness of what is going on around so that they can push the envelope, that capital becomes very small. And like, I think one of the challenges for the bio industry is like what Ritu is alluding to is I think the software or the computer industry is a little bit more matured in those respects where, we are competing with the best and we're able to do that. Whereas in the bio, we are still not there. We're just starting to, take baby steps forward. That's one. So I think it's more of a mindset because 75% of our mindset for bio is still very complacent, right? We are very happy to take research that's already been published like 25 times, do a little bit more work there and publish it again. And unfortunately, that's where we are. I think that's one. Second is the process. Okay, I have an idea and, I am really passionate about it. I want to make this happen. Still, the process to be able to jump in and do it is not as easy. There are a lot of players who are trying to change this. I think, 2013, when I came to Bangalore, there was only 2 incubators in Bangalore, right? And it was not easy to find a space in an incubator. Today, that whole thing has changed, right? And it's only been a matter of 7 years. So I think there are a lot of people trying to change, but it's still not there yet. And, for you to get that initial capital, to be able to do innovative work, build your team, it's not an easy process right now. Part of it is also that I think if you want to bring technologies to market that are not just marginal jumps, that are significant jumps in terms of what we need to do, that technology development needs to happen in partnership with academia. And if you can't rely on that partnership to make some of that to happen, then it takes even that much longer and that much amount of capital and resources to be able to go forward. Lucky to have built the team that we have today, but it wasn't easy.
Yeah, I think the software comparison is apt, but it also breaks down in certain places. So, for example, the reason that the software industry is possible is because it's built on a foundation of the internet and fundamental hardware and infrastructure that's existed for some time. It would be like saying, the mobile, all these platforms, right? So, I think 20 years ago, if you and I had to start a mobile phone company, it would cost a lot of money, or even an internet company, it would cost a lot of money because it was simply not possible. The barriers to even starting a company, let alone scaling, were extremely high. You didn't have the pieces of the ecosystem that existed. I think some of the pieces in the biotech space internationally for alternative proteins are coming together. So if we look at cultivated meat specifically, the different pieces are, the cell lines, the cell culture media, the bioreactors, and the scaffolds if you need to grow a 3D culture of meat, right? And even things like what you're talking about, Ezhil, will go directly into cell culture media, etc. So that's coming together. We're getting the biggest companies in the world, Merck, 3M, they've all announced intent and started work in these areas. But with respect to India right now, I think it's going to be quite a slow burn and we're going to have to work on all things together. So Ezhil, you mentioned incubators, etc., but you also mentioned universities. So CCAMP, Bangalore Bio Innovation Center, BIRAC, the government body. Could you speak a little bit to the kinds of help that are available and that have been available to you? And Ritu, of course, please also play into this as well, because you mentioned that some of the issues here are the government has been helpful, but there's a lot more work that's needed.
See, I think BIRAC is doing a phenomenal job in terms of providing seed capital for high-risk work. Like String started off with a big funded project, right, in India. So I think, and that's just mushroomed in terms of the work that BIRAC's doing. So I think that initial high-risk capital is actually available through agencies like BIRAC. If you look at the cost taken for bio, it is not as significant, but it is a starting point. So I think that is a big plus. Like you talked about, in Bangalore, CCAMP, Bangalore Bioinnovation Center, these are all great infrastructure resources. If you really have an idea and you want to show that initial proof of concept, like what you were talking about, Varun, it's not so hard for you anymore to go rent a bench and have access to some really high-end equipment where you can leverage that to show that initial proof of concept, right? This was not there, just 7 years back. And, if you look at these places, right, they are no less than some of the best state-of-the-art infrastructure that you would see in the West. They have all the high-end equipment required. They have right kind of lab infrastructure that is needed for you to be able to do that. And we've leveraged a lot of that in a big way. Like, for example, for us, the initial fermentation resources, right? Those are really CapEx heavy equipment. We didn't want to invest in that CapEx till we got comfortable with the technology. And, having a Bangalore Bioinnovation Center Actually allowed us to be able to do it because we then leveraged their equipment to get to that initial point. So I think a lot is changing, particularly with these kind of infrastructures that is coming up. And it's not just Bangalore, right? If you look at Pune, look at Chennai, if you look at Hyderabad, I think these hubs are really coming up to enable that infrastructure. What is now very evident, though, is there is a gap in the next phase, which is the scale up, right? Because there's a lot of attention that's gone into that initial phase, and there is a clear gap in the next phase. Like, for example, our pilot scale facility, for a large time, we tried to not invest the capex and see if we could leverage facility for us to do it. Then eventually we had to invest and build our own because, we couldn't wait too long for us to be able to go to market. So, but there is a significant gap in scale up today though.
That's actually very well said and conveniently leads directly into my next question, right? So, Ritu, there's a valley of death everywhere between lab to market or even early stage to market. In India, this valley of death is a massive chasm. Like the scale up capital doesn't really exist per se. The scale up infrastructure doesn't really exist per se. I mean, you need one of those two things, right? Either you need ancillary supporting infrastructure or you need capital so that you can put it down yourself and create your supporting infrastructure. So being that Ankur Capital fund is an early stage fund, how do you work with downstream funders? Is it primarily a matter of working with international funders or are there local private equity firms? How are you currently doing all this education? Because you've done the due diligence upfront. Presumably you have the expertise to do that. Some of these downstream firms may not have that in-house just yet. There might be a lot that you have to do to educate them. So can you speak to that right now?
But in India, I think we have valleys of deaths, right? So there's always a valley of death in front of you, right? There's not one valley. If there was one valley, that would be good, I would say, right? So I think the capital for this just is really kind of absent. I think that there is somewhat in the initial stages, which is absolutely amazing that this kind of happened. But I think you need the hierarchy of capital for all of this to work. It can't just be here's a little, here's a that. At the end of the day, it needs capital, right? If you look at all these companies globally, they've raised, close to $1 billion, right? I mean, there's a hell of a lot of money, right? To get to market to actually commercialize all of this, right? In my view, I think you have to build the cutting edge global technology companies over here. They will attract capital internationally. Not so, because in India, people aren't used. Investors are just not used to investing in something like this. It's not in the risk appetite. Whereas there are other people globally who have the risk appetite and will say, okay, as long as this company is as good as any other, right, and structurally I can manage all of this, I would be willing to take a look at it. And I think if you improve that cycle, then you will have Indian investors wake up to say, why am I missing out on this? I also need to get into it. I think it's a viable thing. So I think the valleys of death have to be navigated in this. And I think those bridges are going to be built not necessarily with the VC capital sitting in India. It can be some strategics in India that take a look who are, in the domain. So they do understand that piece completely. But I think it will also take financial investors who are more domain experts to come in from internationally into these things.
And there are also other interesting investment instruments. So, for example, the government of Canada just announced a $100 million debt facility to a plant-based protein extraction facility. And it was a mix of public debt and other instruments, which is the kind of thing that needs to happen because we're talking $100 million. Obviously, in biotech, it's going to be like that, right? So we're going to have a mix of these kind of downstream funders who are strategics, pure financial investors, public funds, debt, different kinds of instruments, different kinds of vehicles, which is really great. I've left the most fun question for last. That's about regulatory, because I know we all love thinking about regulatory. So could you speak a little bit to regulatory hurdles and how you're thinking about it? Because, we all know this. When industries grow, they become entrenched. The entrenched players actually use a lot of technology. All of our entrenched industries use a lot of technology, including food, right? Crop breeding, animal breeding, all the processing facilities, putting animals close together, figuring out how to milk them, all of that stuff. There's a ton of technology involved there. But we've locked in regulatory hurdles now, and new technologies like fermentation, etc., will have some hurdles to get over to get to market. So I guess I'll throw this to you, Ritu, first, because how are you thinking about regulatory risk as an investor? And then I'd love to hear from Ezhil as well.
So I think regulatory risks are obviously something that you pre-evaluate pre an investment here, right? And I think it depends on markets that you're kind of targeting. So I think we kind of take a look at it from that. We have some other companies also how their regulation is an important piece here. And as an investor, I want to know what the journey is for you to get over that regulatory hurdle, right? How much money and how long, right? Both are the two questions I need an answer to. So I think that's something that you kind of do upfront, and you kind of probably, bucket in that there are going to be sort of hurdles. Having said that anytime you look at something in the India market, actually I would say the regulations are super weak in many ways, right? So either they're cut, copy, paste, or they're just, the bars are so low. And you would think that that's a great thing, but actually it's not. Because what it does is it takes really good technology and puts it on the same level as something that's just tweak here, right? So the value of that technology is something that the market doesn't recognize. So I think in India, we need to do more about it. We don't need to make this a bureaucratic thing, but I think we need to think about it that we actually, if we're going to encourage a deep tech, deep innovation to kind of happen here, you've also got to differentiate between that and your middle-of-the-run product that's in the market. And that part in India is not very strong.
Ezhil, could you speak a little bit to regulation and how you're thinking about it?
Sure. How much time do I have?
Ezhil and I have been talking about regulation since we first met on August 24th, 2018 at the Future of Protein Summit, the first one that when it was just me at GFI India that we put on in Hyderabad. So that was the first time we met. We've been talking about regulation since then. But Ezhil, any update?
So I think Ritu highlighted a very interesting point, right? I think the challenge with regulation in India is the lack of clarity, right? Because for technologies like us who want to bring these kind of products to market and for, who have investors on board, we want to have some surety that, okay, if I do XYZ test, then I'm safe. But here the way some of these markets work is they leave everything gray, that there is never surety as to what is required. That's one. And two, because it's gray, there's no differentiation between the good, bad, and ugly, right? But I think the driver is we wait for the market to change, and then once the market changes, then we bring on the regulation. So I think the good thing for the alternative protein industry is that there is a lot of momentum in this space and there is a lot of awareness around the products, which means that the consumers are starting to demand more of these products. And I think that will be the driver for the regulatory change here. Unfortunately, the way it works here, it's always backward looking, right? It's not forward looking thought for the regulation. I hope that, given all the interest in this industry now, there is more and more conversations around regulation and hence the change that is needed. But see, the other challenge that, I know we've talked about it, Varun, a few times, is one of the other big gaps, and this is not just in India, I think it is there in a lot of places globally, is for having some kind of standardized certifications around these new products coming to market, right? Like how much of testing is enough for you to show that alternative protein-based fish that you have is as good as a wild-caught salmon, right? And what is the level of testing that you need? And is there any way for us to standardize those kind of testing? I mean, this is a conversation that happens in Singapore, but, Singapore has taken a step forward and said, okay, I'm going to set up my own testing center so that I can be the person who standardizes it, not just for Singapore, but the entire Southeast Asian market. I think you need a lot of that because that goes hand in hand with the regulation, right? That makes it easy for the regulatory bodies to then make that decision.
I think we are a country that adopts, we wait and watch and we adopt, right, when necessary, which doesn't necessarily work for certain sectors, for people who are trying to innovate. It just doesn't really work, right? And when you don't do that, what happens is the market sets the proxy at some other international regulator. Right? So then you just have to meet the proxy of that. So then it doesn't matter what the local regulation is because the market will set it as what they consider as the appropriate regulation. Yeah.
I'm with you. I want to offer a little bit of the other side because I think we all work with government. We at GFI work with government very extensively. So just to give you a sense of like what the capacity of the government is in India, right? Like Ezhil, you're from Bangalore. The city of Bangalore has, for some definition of city, they have 8 million people. The city of New York has 8 million people for the same definition of city, right? Okay. The government of Bangalore has 20,000 employees, okay? The government of New York City has 462,000 employees. This is a vast difference between the capacity of the government in these two countries, all right? The FSSAI, the food safety regulator in India, I know they're on a hiring drive now, which is going to take them from roughly 350 people to roughly 650 people. All right. And at 650 people, they will still be woefully understaffed. to deal with 1.345 billion Indians, right, and deal with food safety. So I think these are going to be perennial problems that we have to be clever about. Strategic advisory in this country about providing links to those international regulators, all of that stuff. I'm with you entirely, and we just have to understand the dynamics and be clever about it. I'm so glad you brought up the standards thing, Ezhil, by the way, and I'll just round out by saying this. I think this is the first time we're announcing this anywhere globally. We're happy to announce that we're working on standards for specifically actually starting with alternative seafood first, and then going into the other areas. So with a certification agency that's well known across food certifications, we'll be working on alternative seafood certification to circumvent some of the same problems that you mentioned. So, if there are sustainability claims, we should make it clear. We should cast a light exactly on the supply chain and show exactly why what we're doing is better. So there's a lot that we're working on right now that I think will be good. But it's a process.
Mention the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO, and it's more likely than not that you'll be met with pride and satisfaction. Our National Space Agency is a beacon of innovation in typically Indian style, frugal and ingenious. The agency famously launched the Mars Orbiter mission in 2016 for only 450 crore rupees. That's roughly $67 million at the time. And no, that's not a mistake. Indians sent an orbiter to Mars for $67 million. It's the kind of amazing cost innovation that we can bring to the alternative protein landscape, and companies like String are proving that true with their microbial fermentation tech.
But as both Ezhil and Ritu mentioned, there's plenty of work to do yet, and this is going to be a long journey. As we navigate the next decade through this crucible moment, the COVID-19 pandemic has given us occasion to take stock and invest in innovation. The Indian government has been clear about the need to be vocal for local, supporting self-sufficiency with its Atmanirbhar Bharat program. If we can support ingenious entrepreneurship and technology development that helps feed India and advances the global smart protein sector, the gains to the planet, people, profit, and even space exploration could be tremendous.
And if you want to start a company in this space or are interested in just learning more about this sector as a researcher or want to collaborate, please do reach out. You can also join our GF Ideas India Smart Protein Innovation community on LinkedIn or follow us on social media. We are Good Food India on Twitter and the Good Food Institute India on Instagram. And we leave all those URLs as well as the LinkedIn URL in our description.
If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am at VarunD7 on Twitter and at Varun5 on Instagram. You can come ask me why.
And if you want to reach out to me, I'm Cryptic Caprice on Twitter and Dithering Funambulist on Instagram. Please don't ask me why. We look forward to having you with us every week. And of course, if you'd like to be part of accelerating the future of our food system, please just get in touch. You can email us at india@gfi.org.
My name is Varun Deshpande, Managing Director at the Good Food Institute India.
And I'm Ramya Ramurthy, the Communications Specialist at the Good Food Institute India. And you have been a part of Feeding 10 Billion Season 2.
Namaskar, dear Bandhu. My name is Ashish Vidyarthi. These are truly challenging times, and in these times, we need hope. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey. Available on IVM Podcasts, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, there is hope because there's one life and we are alive.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I am Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives, and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis, and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.